Okay, everyone, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. We are going into now our session on climate change, and we talked a lot this morning about a lot of different challenges, but I think we're probably all agreed on climate change being the biggest challenge of all our lifetimes and of the generations to come. And the question that we want to pose now at this next panel is, ultimately, how does the public sector respond, play its part, given the seriousness of what lies ahead? How do we innovate? How do we do things differently, using new technologies, developing new policies and implementing new practices? And we're joined by three incredible speakers in Mark Griffin, Secretary-General of the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. We're joined by Rachael Singleton, Northern Ireland Innovation Labs, and by Maurice Buckley, Chairperson of the Office of Public Works. And through each of them, I think what you're going to hear is different approaches, one talking on policy, one on behaviour in Rachel's case, and then on practice. And so hopefully what you're going to have through 10 minutes from each of them is a real holistic sense of those three factors, the policy, the behaviour and the practice, when we come back out then to a Q&A, and that we can really try to get to grips with the very ambitious targets that have been set through the Climate Action Plan, and how does the public service rise to meet the moment ahead of us. So with all of that, we're going to go into presentations now. Keep your questions coming through Slido. We'll have microphones again. I'll weave the Slido questions in. We'll come to you here in the audience as well towards the end. And first up, we have Mark, who's representing the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. Thanks, Mark. Give him a round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anya. And I'll pack as much as I can into 9 minutes and 56 seconds. So look, I just want to do a bit of scene setting. Look at the first slide. You see that every day of the week when you turn on the TV, the impacts that we're seeing right across the world from climate action. Devastating floods in Pakistan we would have seen this year, wildfires in California, extreme temperatures in Europe, drought, crop destruction, food shortages and forced migration, accelerating sea level rise and increased rate of ocean warming and ice melt. And that's just a simple fact. And when you look at what the IPCC said this year, they stated as a matter of fact that every country is now seeing the effects of climate change. So what are we doing about it? At international level, for a small country, actually, we pack a significant punch in terms of the work we do through overseas aid. Very engaged through the COP process, COP27 in Egypt, starting in the next couple of weeks. Nice comment there from Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. No power group alone can call all the shots, and that's a reality. This is a global movement. It is a global coalition of governments who want to do the right thing, most of them for countries most affected by climate action. And it's a simple fact that the countries that are least capable of adjusting to the climate impacts or mitigating the climate impacts are the ones that are the most significantly affected. So the least developed countries, the small island developing nations, seriously affected by the impacts of climate action. We in Ireland will be working with them at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We've already given a commitment to increase our funding to €225 million by 2025. So very active as a small country in supporting the international effort to deal with climate action. Lena mentioned in her presentation this morning about the EU speeding up, and that is a statement of fact. We've seen the EU gear up the responses to climate action over the last number of years. They've produced their Fit for 55 package. So it's looking at initiatives covering climate, environment, energy, transport, industry, agriculture and sustainable finance. All set out there on the slide, massive ambition. And in fact, again, as Lena mentioned this morning, what you're seeing since the start of the war in the Ukraine is the EU doubling down on the need to affect that climate transition, invest more in renewables, invest more in energy efficiency, and reduce and ultimately remove that reliance that a lot of member states have on Russian oil and gas and invest more in these technologies while ensuring a just transition for those most effective. What are we doing at national level? I would say as the Secretary General of the Department of the Environment that we're doing a huge amount. The programme for government in 2020, and there was very significant negotiation around this between the three parties in relation to what is it that the government wants to do around climate action, and a significant coming together on very, very ambitious targets. So what we have agreed is that by 2030 we'll reduce emissions by 51% across the economy. We'll put in place climate legislation which would give statutory effect to that. Move to climate neutrality by 2050, require the setting of three series of climate budgets representing 5-year periods, so setting out within each 5-year period what it is you can emit within the economy in terms of carbon emissions. And again, I suppose the innovation piece, what we have done where we haven't seen replicated anywhere across the world is the setting of that statutory carbon budget and the allocation of that across individual sectors. So allocations across buildings, transport, electricity, agriculture, industry and so on, is saying for the coming 5 years, this is what you have to work with in terms of the carbon ceiling that's been allocated to you. We have to set policies, you have to act on them, and you have to transform your sector and your industry to work within that. So massive challenge and a massive transformation required between now and 2030, and even greater transformation required between now and 2050. Again, in terms of innovation, ministerial accountability to the Oireachtas. Ministers have to go in every year and say, here's the progress we're made, here's where we're falling short, here's the additional measures that we're putting in place, and so on. And all of that is legislated for. So the courts can step in if needs be and make a determination on foot of a request from an NGO or a member of the public, make a determination that the state isn't doing enough. The state has to double down and do more. And all of that supported by a climate action plan. So we're producing annual climate action plans. We know the ambition, and what are the actions then that need to be delivered over the coming 5 or 10 year period to deliver that emissions reduction. Just wanted to say a bit about what the public view of climate change is saying, and the slide I think is really interesting. The vast majority, and we've done a lot of research on this both ourselves and through the EPA, the vast majority are aware of climate change as a significant risk and are worried about climate change. So 92%. It is important to them personally at 82% and believe will it harm them 83%. Nearly 95% recognise it will impact on future generations. The vast majority are motivated to take action, 83%, and 85% feel that they are already taking some form of action. And I suppose from a public service perspective, 80% of people surveyed want the government to show leadership on this, and they want the public service to be able to demonstrate the things that can be done to address the climate challenge that the state, that the European Union and that the world is faced with. So the public service leadership piece, you'll see a number of things that I've called out in the slide where I think the public service has a leadership role, where we are doing things and where we need to do more. So I've mentioned about half a dozen things: targets and mandate, funding, proof of concept, citizen engagement, culture, really important one for me, culture, capacity and collaboration, and governance and accountability. So don't underestimate the importance of having targets. I think what we see is there's a big vision there of climate neutrality by 2050. People want to do more in terms of creating a better quality of life for ourselves and for our children. They want to do more in terms of clean air, clean water. They want to do more in terms of public health impacts. But what does that mean, and how do we break that down, and how do we achieve that? So we have, as I said, we've set out the targets, the governance and the accountability. That's clearly defined. It's underpinned by law. We know what the North Star is. Through our actions, a better quality of life for people and a strong, modernised, sustainable economy. For the public sector, we know, and again it's set out in the Climate Action Plan, what we're meant to achieve. So a 51% emissions reduction by 2030, the same as a national target, and a 51% target for energy efficiency within the public sector. And we've actually seen how successful the public sector has been in dealing with energy efficiency over the last number of years. We had the highest target for energy efficiency savings right across the economy up to 2020. We had a target of 33%. We met, and actually most parts of the public sector exceeded that. So we have a very good track record of delivering. The funding piece, really, really important, and was mentioned in Lena's presentation as well. We've committed 165 billion in the National Development Plan between now and 2030, much of that directly related to climate action. And the entire National Development Plan has been climate-proof. So all of the programmes that are set out in the National Development Plan have been put through the ringer in terms of their impact on climate, their impact on the environment, and their impact on sustainability, both positive and negative. So things like compact growth, sustainable mobility, skills development, renewable energy, energy efficiency, all there as programmes in the NDP, all climate-proofed. Very, very significant investment coming from the state, both in terms of the central state funding through the Exchequer, but also very significant investment by our state agencies. State agencies, really, really important. I was speaking to a colleague coming down the train this morning who spoke to me about the transformation of Bord na Móna from brown to green. So Bord na Móna is set up as a company under the 1947 Turf Development Acts, with the role of providing jobs in the Midlands, extracting peat from the bogs, supporting the development of energy industries in the region from the late 40s right through to probably the last 5 or 10 years, more so the last 5 years. The company has turned itself on its head in a very short period of time. It's a renewable energy company. It's a resource recovery company. It's a solar generation company. It's utterly transformed, and it's really great to see how a state company can show that leadership in climate action. Citizen engagement, critically important for the public sector. Every opportunity we get, informally or formally, engage with the public, help them understand what this is all about, and give them the tools to develop climate action initiatives at their own level. Capacity, culture and collaboration. Unless there's a cultural change right across the public sector, we will struggle to deliver the climate action mandate that government has asked us to deliver on. Capacity, John O'Neill is here from the IPA doing a major review of capacity across the civil service initially, but hopefully to extend it to the public sector to see how civil and public service organisations are equipped to deliver on the climate challenge. And then the culture piece, which again I think is really important for me, how we knit the need or the taking of climate action into the DNA of public servants and public servants organisation. So strategy formation, business planning, policy and operations, risk management, annual reports, emissions valuation and investment appraisals, senior management and board meetings, internal and external communications, learning and development, our R&D policies. We invest massive sums of money right across the state system in R&D, so to the extent to which they need to be reoriented to support the overall mission. Finally, and conscious of time, I'm going to mention a few examples. Sometimes when we think about innovation, we think it's about landing the first person on Mars. Far more simple than that, in my view. And again, to pick up on that piece that Lena had in her presentation about public-public, public-private, or in some cases public-public-private. We we have in our department a major ambition of delivering 7 gigawatts of offshore wind, including 2 gigawatts of hydrogen by 2030. That was the initial target set in the programme for government 2 years ago was 5 gigawatts. It's been upped in the last number of months. When the current government came into office, we were effectively starting with a blank canvas. And I think when you look at how public sector organisations can collaborate, there's massive potential. We've put in place a delivery task force. It's chaired by the Minister, actually. And what we've sought to do is pull together all the various components of activity and effort that are required across the public sector to move from that blank canvas to deliver this new industrial strategy and to deliver 7 gigawatts by 2030. So in the last couple of years, we have a new National Marine Planning Framework. We have new legislation in place, the Marine Area Planning Act. We have a new state agency, MARA, being stood up and being fully operational from early next year. We have the first Marine Area Planning Consents issued for the 7 strategic offshore projects on the East Coast. We have a new division being established on board Penala focused exclusively on offshore renewables. We have an offshore renewable energy development plan near finalisation, which will be able to say, well, here's the best places within our exclusive economic zone to locate these developments. We'll have the first offshore auction process by the end of the year. A new hydrogen strategy is in development, ports policy and supply chains being addressed. And all of that critically important for an industry who are prepared to invest up to 50 billion in a new industrial strategy. So that collaborative piece, the public-private, hugely important. There's 2 other ones that I'll just briefly mention. There's a very good example, again, I spoke to a colleague on the way down the train about circular economy. Like when you talk to people about circular economy, nobody knows what circular economy means. But when you see the sort of, and this is an important component of the climate action debate, when you see the sort of projects that are being brought forward now that are circular economy, that are impactful from a climate action perspective, some of them are actually simple at one level, but mind-blowing at another level. I'll just mention this one briefly. Net 360 it's called. So commercial fishing nets have a useful lifespan of about 1 to 3 years. 2 companies, Verifacta software company, partnered with Novel Plast, a recycler, to track end-of-life fishing nets. They use a blockchain traceability system to track the product right through its life cycle. The final product carries a QR code. Consumers can scan to learn the verified story of the project. And that story of the project is crucial as it creates added value to the end product by limiting concerns consumers may have regarding unverified environmental claims, i.e. greenwashing. So a simple thing like that has massive potential in terms of upscaling. And this is where the funding piece comes back in, because this was funded through a grant from our own department under the Circular Economy Innovation Grant Scheme. So public sector as a grantor, supporting innovation and using small projects like that as proof of concept and scalers for other projects. Finally, and I just go back to our state agencies, Bord na Móna I mentioned, on Post, the first postal service provider globally to attain zero carbon emission delivery status in all major cities, having replaced its fleet with EVs. Airgrid, world leader on the integration of renewable electricity to the grid. And that's really important when you look at the fact that we're proposing to deliver 80% renewables on the grid by 2030. There are any number of innovative projects that I could have spoken about today. And I think one of the things as a public servant that we need to recognise, I think, is we're quiet about talking about the good things that are going on in our areas. We're quiet about talking about the extent of innovation that is happening in every single government department and state agency. And we're modest about sharing those with the wider public, and I think we need to get over that. So thank you very much. I've run over time, but not too much over time.
Thank you. Well done. Thank you, Mark Griffin, Secretary-General, Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. Up next, oh, actually, I think we've Maurice's slides ready next, do we? I think Maurice might be next, Rachel.
No problem.
If we click, yeah, we'll come to you next, Rachel. And Maurice, I think you're teed up next. So Maurice Buckley, Chairperson of the Office of Public Works. Please give him a round of applause, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel.
Afternoon, everybody. Great to be here in Cork. I'm the practitioner that Anya mentioned, so I'm going to mention a couple of areas where OPW works, which I think are relevant. One is energy management in buildings, but first of all, flood risk management and dealing with climate change. I've seen many humanitarian disasters in the world, but I've never seen climate carnage on this scale. Oops, don't know what happened there. I must have done something. Try and get back to the main slide. Oh yeah, okay, fine, yep, good. That's Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, and this, of course, is the flooding in Pakistan this year. Mark referred to all the disasters we've had. Not unique to places like Pakistan, and not unique to this year. This is Dublin in 2011, the Shannon Basin 2014 and 15, and here in lovely Cork back in 2009. Very severe flooding in Ireland and getting worse. Clonmel, Tipperary, one of the towns most badly affected, now completely sorted. There's a very complete flood relief scheme in operation there now. And again, a view of Cork back in November 2009, just how severe the flooding was. All over the whole area here in green, in the island where the Lee splits in two. And you are today, luckily enough, just outside the green area. You can relax anyway because it's dry. I checked at lunchtime, no rain. But seriously, the whole of Cork is built on a very flat area. The entire area in green there is susceptible to flooding and is about to be protected with the biggest flood relief scheme that the OPW has ever done, the Lower Lee Flood Relief Scheme, which is going through the whole planning process at the moment. And these type of schemes involve, just to give you a little flavour, sometimes protection. You see the wall there on the right-hand side is what's going to hold back the water if the river level really rises, but you can use the space inside that wall to have amenity areas like parks and playgrounds and so on, so long as they can get wet if there's a flood and still recover quickly. A lot of resistance from communities and so on, and understandably so, because you're changing the landscape of rivers, you're changing the landscapes of towns, and these are where we live, and there's a huge importance in getting it right. So we're trying and we're learning every time to get better and better, engage more and more with communities. So there you're seeing the wall is relatively low. What we're doing is actually raising the road so that you don't have the impression there's a higher wall, but the wall is quite high over the river, as you can see, in the glass segments, so the children can look through and so on and so forth. That's river flooding primarily, and the existing flooding we're used to. But what about sea level rise? Something I don't think we talked about 5 or 10 years ago. Just to give the example of Dundalk. It's kind of hard to see on that map there, but you can see Dundalk there on the left. It's very hard to see on the big screen. Do I have a pointer on this? Not sure. The green laser, does it work? Green laser, it does, yeah. Okay, so here's Dundalk. I have to check where it is here, yeah. Dundalk is here. This is water normally. This is the bay inlet. And the light green area is areas that can flood right now in what we call a 1% flood. So there's a 1% probability of such a flood. And you can see it's a huge area. But at the moment, if that flood were to happen, and thankfully there hasn't been a major flood in Dundalk, there's a relatively small number of houses and properties and people affected. If so, we go forward. With climate change, it's accepted now, even with even if we succeed in limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, at the end of this century, 2100, sea level will have risen by approximately 1 metre. And that's a huge phenomenon, obviously, in an island country like Ireland. So now you see you're talking about a vast area here that now floods, that wasn't flooded in the current scenario, and huge number, hundreds of houses and properties that will be affected. So that is a very big concern for a country like Ireland. So let's just look at some figures here. This is for the city of Limerick at the mouth of the Shannon. So is exposed to heavy river flooding from the whole Shannon Basin, a huge river basin, and then of course coastal flooding as well. The top line here, current scenario, present day. So this is just an estimate of the economic damage that would happen. And excuse the terminology, but 10% annual estimated probability or annual event probability is something that you might expect to happen in maybe 1 in 10 years, 1 in 100 years, and 1 in 1,000 years. So you can see at a 10% probability, you're talking about 90 properties, 3 million euro damage a year in the flood event. In a big flood, 100-year event, that goes right up to 80 million damage. And in a 1,000-year flood, 500 million damage. So you can see how it scales up. But what's interesting is if you come down along the line, the mid-range scenario is 0.5 metre sea level rise, and the high-end future scenario is 1 metre sea level rise. Now, 1 metre might sound a lot, and perhaps that's been a bit extreme and a bit kind of overly risque, but it's not. It's not. Now the experts are saying with 1.5 degree temperature rise, it'll almost certainly hit 1 metre sea level rise and probably hit it before the end of the century. With a 3 degree temperature rise, it'll be 2 metres. So that's not even on this chart. But look at the figures involved. 1 in 10 years, 10% likelihood, 400 million euro damage in every single flood event. And by the time you get up to the very high flood events, 1.8 billion. So it's just phenomenal. And what some of my colleagues would say is we almost end up with sea level rise having what is now a 1 in 100 year unlikely flooding event happening almost every year. Huge challenge for us. They say, we showed river flooding at the beginning, and in all of Europe, it costs roughly 8 billion euros per year. That's an assessment of the economic damage due to flooding. By the end of the century, that'll have gone up to 50 billion euros per year due to river flooding and increased storms and so on. Sea level and coastal erosion, coastal flooding, it causes about 2 billion euro of damage a year, and in the same time frame, that will go up to 240 billion a year of damages. A phenomenal increase. So that is where the really big issues will be. Coastal erosion, when the storms hit, and if I go back one slide, I think I skipped over it. When you get a really bad storm in combination with high tide and those events, obviously the effect on the coastline is huge. This is the town of Lahinch back in 2013, 2014. And as a result of that, not just do you have a problem of flooding, but you have a problem with the coast eroding away. So here's several different examples here, and you can see what's happening. The cliff face is eroding away, and houses, infrastructure like roads, railways, not to mention social infrastructure, beaches and golf course, are threatened. So the OPW, when we look at flood risk planning, flood risk protection in towns and villages around the country, and particularly along the coast, we try and plan for the future. And there's 4 ways of doing this, really. You see the 3 charts show the present day, this 0.5 metre sea level rise and 1 metre sea level rise with a corresponding increase in intensity of storms. And there's basically 4 things you can do. Assumptive. First of all, you can design the protection now so that it caters for future eventualities, but that's very expensive. Then adaptive, which is what we try to do most of the time. You build it now, but you maybe have the foundations of the wall or whatever it might be such that it can be increased later on at relatively low expense and low inconvenience. The third one is alternative. maybe that flood defence won't work at all. You have to do something else. And the last one, which is the one we want to avoid, and it's almost impossible to contemplate really, is accepting that the flood will happen and the community involved might be caught. And the word abandon has been used. So is it an option to abandon a community? I don't think it is. This is one example of a town called Fairborn in Wales, on Cardigan Bay there. It's a small settlement, about 700 people, but because of the way it's stretched out along the coast there and the ground conditions and everything else, there is no way to protect that town and that community from future events, or horrendously expensive to do so. So the Welsh government said, well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to relocate you. And you can imagine the response to that, the climate refugees, they call themselves. And I think people had to backtrack quickly. But it is something that we're going to have to face in the very near future. And it might be something people want to talk about and ask about, because we are an island nation and our cities are around the coast. Very quickly, moving to a second topic, and that is energy management. So OPW are responsible for a lot of the public buildings in the state. And we're working very hard to make those buildings more efficient, to help Mark meet the targets, or rather to meet the targets for Mark, maybe, if we can. And there are tough targets. But I just want to highlight a couple of things which are interesting, and interesting in the psychology as well, which is one of the aspects we're looking at. So back in 2008, OPW and SEAI started a program. We called it Optimizing Power at Work, where really it was soft things. It was just changing behaviour of people in public buildings. First of all, in the central government buildings, then we added public hospitals and schools and so on later on. But just through changing behaviour, turning off the lights, lowering the heat, buying equipment that's more energy conscious, we actually saved 25%. Very little capital investment needed. You can see there almost 30% of carbon dioxide equivalent savings. And 9.1 million. So that is huge. And then we went on in the latter stage. Of course, the low-hanging fruit becomes harder to find, and you have to invest more on what we call pathfinder projects. So about 120 projects across the system between 2017 and 2020. And they were relatively simple things, changing lighting, LED lighting, the way we control heat and light, that the lights go off and there's nobody in the room, boiler upgrades, heat pumps, photovoltaic, stuff like that. And again, made significant progress. And I'll just give you one example. This is government offices in Ennis, County Clare. So we did a couple of things. It's hard to read there. We upgraded the fabric of the building, so external insulation, roof and ceiling insulation, light replacement, air tightness, 600,000 of a budget. Not huge, but significant. You can see it's a relatively small building. And then the second block on the right is M&E, mechanical and electrical upgrades. So heat pumps, mechanical ventilation, and heat recovery from the warm air, LED lighting, photovoltaic, and EV charging for cars. And again, about 600,000 on those measures. So combining that, the results were that the BER energy rating for the building increased from C3 up to A3. There was a 38, just under 40% reduction in carbon dioxide and in 2020, and that will increase to 55% in total once we take into account grid benefits that are happening at the same time when we're measuring the total output. So it's on a path. We're working with Mark's department and with SAI to really improve public buildings in terms of energy performance. And that involves two things really. What we do proactively do, which is use renewable, change over to heat pumps, bioenergy, district heating where we can, transport, electric vehicles, biofuels, electricity, photovoltaics, wind. Difficult in public buildings that tend to be 3 or 4 stories high, so it's difficult to get a huge amount of photovoltaic, but we do that, and sometimes in the grounds can be done. And then use less, fewer buildings, remote working now, shared offices, all of that. We have a responsibility to try and do things like that, and that is probably the most efficient way to reduce our usage. Lighting, computers, ICT, and transport. And of course, the whole target is to design for net zero. We're doing that already. All new facilities are designed for near zero energy emissions. So I've run over as well. That's just a summary of the next phase of the Pathfinder project. 30 million investment with SAI and the department, and these now are getting into a little bit heavier weight schemes where there's more money required because, as I said, the low-hanging fruit has been absorbed. And you start to get into an argument here now, or a discussion here, and it's something we might pick up on, is where is the money most effective? Do we invest a lot of money in very old buildings to make them energy efficient? What do we get from that? Versus what I spoke about earlier, the flood risk management, the climate action, and the investment that we as an island nation are going to need in that area. We probably have to do both, but it's something we need to discuss. Just before I go, just can't speak without mentioning just the topical aspect of this winter and the energy crisis forced on us by the very tragic and unfortunate war in the Ukraine. So again, we're working very closely with SAI on behalf of the department, on behalf of the government, on developing a campaign and advice and for public buildings. You all know about the people have been asked to reduce the temperature to 19 degrees, which is just on the borderline comfort, turn off lighting buildings, reduce the hours, turn off the heat a bit earlier, all sorts of different measures. There's information available on that. You might say some of this is, again, it's sending a message as opposed to saving a phenomenal amount of energy, but that message is really, really important. And we in the public service, we're role models for society, so it's very important that we take that responsibility very serious. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Maurice Buckley, Chairperson, Office of Public Works. And up next, we have Rachael Singleton, who's from the Northern Ireland Innovation Labs, and I think your slides are now actually next, Rachael. Thank you.
I'm not sure if that's up yet. No?
There we go.
Great. It is really lovely to be here back in Cork. Thank you for having me. I spent a lot of my childhood summers in Skibbereen, where my grandfather was from. So it's just nice to be back. I'm going to talk to you today from a few different perspectives. Firstly, we'll go back a bit. I followed my grandfather's footsteps into the civil service, and that was over 20 years ago. At that point, I started in the First Minister's private office up in Stormont. A few months later, there was suspension of devolution, and I feel a need to say at this point it had nothing to do with my arrival. But following that, I was moved to a role as an environmental policy advisor within our Department of the Environment, which is now joined with DARD and is DERA in the north. In that role, I was responsible for working on drafting policy and legislation in order to protect the environment and to make sure that it was there and continued to be there in a functioning state for our population, for our citizens or our users, depending on what terminology you want to use. A lot of work went into that, both from civil servants' perspectives, from the ministers, the executive, the wider assembly. I, in particular, worked on the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act, and that involved work as well with regard to the nitrate vulnerable zone regs that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. I then moved on to an air quality role. What seemed to be a recurring theme, though, was that with the best will in the world and an awful lot of resource and a lot of enthusiasm and very hard work, there was a bit of a gap in what we were doing. We weren't always identifying the people whose behaviours, our policies and our services we're trying to drive and we're trying to support. It's a gap that prevailed for some time, and it was frustrating because we were engaging with stakeholders and consulting to as great a degree as possible. But in truth, when I look back, it wasn't that user-centred approach that we've listened to and from many people today. 8 years ago, the Northern Ireland Innovation Lab was set up. It is a very small team within Public Sector Reform Division, and that's within our Department of Finance. It was set up to try to fill that exact gap, to try to find new and to apply new methodologies, innovative approaches as such, to better designing and better implementing our policy. There are 4 methodologies that we use at the moment. The one I'm going to focus on is behavioural science, because that's my background, my expertise. I am also going to mention service design, because increasingly we're working with our service designers in a really joined and collaborative approach. But essentially, the Innovation Lab was tasked with tackling what we would consider wicked problems, those difficult to resolve challenges that all of those policies, all of those pieces of legislation were really trying to drive, and they were just falling a wee bit short. The sorts of things that we worked on and we still work on would be most recently, we've heard people mention COVID again, another theme that's of course been pervasive in all of our lives. We looked from the behavioural perspective at COVID transmission behaviour and tried to better inform people, but also to better enable those behaviours that would be safer, that would prevent the spread of COVID. We would also deal with areas like the poverty situation in terms of making sure that our population have access to the benefits and supports that they need. And that could be something as simple as, and this is one part of it I should say, it could be something as simple as understanding the language that these benefit recipients use. So, for example, we have an older population who are entitled to some of these benefits, and they really balked at that language, that benefit language. They didn't see themselves as people who took from the state as they would have perceived it. And really, we had to get in there closer to those users in order to identify that. So our communication with them changed radically. Instead of sending out a letter that was essentially offering people access to, when I say free money, money that they were very much entitled to, we approached that by applying psychology and saying, where are these people coming from? How can we better reach them? How can we use what we know about psychology and about the psychology of behaviour change in particular to drive the uptake of access to these benefits? That was our Make the Call campaign. Another area that we would deal with is our obesity framework and trying to drive healthier eating. So you can see a vast array of different sort of subject areas, and that's because we support the public sector in Northern Ireland, all of the government departments and the wider public sector. So it's interesting, it's exciting. You get to deal in new subjects, but always bring in that behavioural science perspective. Somebody mentioned earlier, and I find it really, really interesting, that idea of being able to grow and thrive and develop and learn from within your role and from within your workplace. I've benefited from that myself. I'm in the process of finishing a 3-year PhD that looks at how we apply psychology of behaviour change to increase in pro-environmental behaviour. That's at Ulster University. I've been doing that alongside my work. I like to keep busy. And that in particular is looking at, when we're talking about these huge climate change, climate crisis, I would say, issues, beach littering seems almost insignificant in that grand scheme of things. But year on year, the litter on the beaches in Northern Ireland is increasing, and year on year, the funding that's going in to remediating that is increasing. And so we continue. So my research takes that psychology approach and says, how do we combine the psychology of human behaviour with human-centred design to really get a better understanding of what is going on when people choose the beach that they visit predominantly on the cleanliness and the aesthetic of the beach, leave that beach littered? It doesn't make a lot of sense, and there's no common sense to that. So that's one way in which, from the environmental perspective, I'm trying to apply this behavioural science learning. And in order to sort of translate that into some, I think, accessible preliminary findings that I've identified so far, firstly, thinking pro-environmentally is not the same as behaving pro-environmentally. Now, why does that matter in terms of what we're talking about today? Well, a lot of what I've done and a lot of what many of us have really tried hard to do is to inform people, to give them more knowledge, to give them more information as to why what they're doing isn't a good idea. And even when we do think it's a good idea, it doesn't necessarily lead to the behaviour that we're hoping for. Intending, even if we get to the thought process and get beyond that to those intentions, intending to behave pro-environmentally also is not the same as behaving pro-environmentally, and that's where we would speak in psychology and wider behavioural science arena, as we would speak of that as the intention-action gap, and it's something I think we all see. I certainly, looking back at some of those NVZ regs and some of what, looking back, were barriers, for example, to farmers in participating, or in terms of them doing the things that needed to happen in order for the policy to be implemented in a meaningful way. I didn't honestly look at that from that user-centred approach and apply that understanding of psychology that says, well, what's stopping them? You know, we need to bring more science into the implementation of the brilliant science that's out there. And it is more effective, and this is probably some good news, to make the pro-environmental behaviour easier. Again, it sounds obvious, but very often we don't build in for facilitating the behaviours that we actually want to happen. And then we've got, yes, that sense of valuing. What we value can drive our behaviours, and that's where, again, I would highlight the importance of going into a user-centred space and saying, what is it that matters? What is it that matters to that person that you're trying to incentivise into installing a heat pump, for example? Because it might be more important to them that their neighbours all do that than that they're in any way impacting on our global and climate crisis. We need to meet people where they are. And the only way we can meet them where they are is by understanding where they are, and by using a theory of psychology and a theory of behaviour change. We can really do that better. And then that sense of the vast knowledge and insight that our citizens have, that's something that we in the lab are very well aware of, and it's key to what we do, not only to engage with our citizens, but to actively involve them, and that involves co-design. And by co-design, I don't mean that we hand people things to do and we watch them do it and then we applaud them and say, that's great, you've done co-design. I mean bringing the research to the people and including them in the original research as well, and right through from that initial scoping, and in terms of that design approach, right through from scoping to the testing of our prototypes and then the onward implementation. We need to have users in there because they know a lot about these problems. They're the people dealing with them in the day-to-day. And we're missing a real wealth of insight and wealth of potential to bring change, and to bring change it's going to work better. So yeah, that sense of a multidisciplinary approach. We're working in so many different sectors and so many, dare I say, silos at times to try to rectify and to try to bring something to address these huge challenges. And we really do need to, in my opinion, collaborate a lot better. We need to benefit from the expertise, from the insights, and from the subject knowledge of others. And that's something somebody referred to earlier as well. It's that sense of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts, and it really is. So whether you're using behavioural science to try to reduce antimicrobial resistance through GP prescribing behaviours, or you're trying to get people to make that call to access benefits, or you're trying to get people to use bins, key to all of that, from our perspective, is taking a behavioural science approach that better understands the behaviours that would need to happen, and then coming forward from that, saying what ingredients, what behavioural components or drivers or enablers do we need to build into what we're doing in order to make sure that all of this work that's being done actually translates into meaningful difference. And behavioural science means a theory-driven approach, and it is underpinned by science, and it is very rigorous. Somebody mentioned the kind of the time-consuming nature at times of taking these new approaches. And I think in the initial stages that can be true, but I think in the longer term, we design for change better, and what we come up with, what we produce, can be implemented and can be scaled up in a much more impactful way that doesn't need to be addressed in the immediate future. That requires understanding the behaviours of the people that we're serving, and that's what behavioural science brings. Testing is really, really important. That sense of before we roll something out en masse across a whole population, let's work out if it's actually going to make a difference. And let's work out what aspect of that makes a difference, because it's an awful lot of money goes into these things. Building and improving services, that's key. look, at the heart of what we're all doing is we're serving our public. And sometimes we forget that our work areas are services in a direct or indirect way. And behavioural science and that service design approach allows us better to build and improve those services and to meet the public's needs. And from a policy perspective, and this is close to my own heart, it means that what we draft and what we implement is practical and fit for purpose and makes a difference. So we're trying to close those gaps so that those preferred behaviours are more likely to result and as a result to shape those preferred outcomes. And that makes what we do more effective and less costly. So where do we go from here? Well, 30 years ago, when I stood on Tragumna, probably shivering, I did not foresee worries about sea level rises. Wouldn't have entered my head. We are dealing with an awful lot of unforeseen challenges here, and it's developing and evolving very, very rapidly. And I would propose that to address those challenges, we need a very rapidly evolving toolkit. And that means, firstly, that we bring creativity to the approaches that we use. We bring a bit of fearlessness in trying new things, trying these new methodologies, and trying to integrate them into our day-to-day roles. We need collaboration as well. We need to do this together. And we need communication. I'm a strong believer that we should be working more and we should be working better across the public sector, academia and industry. We do more when we do it together, and we do more when we can bring all that rich learning that's over there somewhere into the real world and into an implementable format where we as operational drivers can make a bigger and a better difference. Thank you.
Right, well done. Thank you, Rachael Singleton from the Northern Ireland Innovation Labs. Those were superb presentations. Thank you, one and all. Mark, maybe to come to you first. Based on what Rachael is talking about there, it's such a compelling argument in terms of, the change in behaviours. Do you think there is a tension between those targets we see in legislation, what Rachael is talking about, or should they and can they coexist?
I think they have to coexist, Anya. I think we all understand what the North Star is and what we want to achieve. When you break climate action down, it's about better future for our kids and our families. It's about better health impacts. It's about a better environment. It's about a modernised economy where you have sustainable jobs. And sometimes targets have a purpose, but I think if the discussion on climate action always revolves around targets, I think we've got a massive problem, because it can be a big turn-off in the sense that people are saying, well, actually, we're doing something because it's just a target. There's a bigger vision and a bigger picture that needs to be constantly painted by us. The targets do have a role. I remember a former minister of mine saying to me, in the absence of targets or actions, trying to figure out what's going on, it's like looking into a bush. You can't actually put your finger on the pulse and saying progress has been made in a particular area. We know where the issues are. We know where we need to intervene. So all of that is really, really important. I think the way that we've put it in place now through legislation and the governance arrangements that are in the Act and the accountability that is there for ministers every year is really, really strong and will help us in setting that direction and monitoring progress over the next number of years. I think a really, really critical piece around this, and we only touched on it earlier, is the need for continuous engagement with the public. Because the reality is, and you've seen some of it in the I think it was slide 5 in the presentation, public are very engaged on this. They know it's a big issue. They're concerned about it, but they need help and they want help and they need guidance. We had a very successful engagement with the public last year, 3,800 people, Corlin and Oak, public participation networks, and the focus that we have as a government department is you build the coalition at local level, because people really, they understand it, they want to do it, and you provide the supports that are needed to ensure that action at local level can happen, and that you build from the ground up, as well as doing the piece at the national level, and you'll meet somewhere in between. So there's a tension, but I think it's a healthy enough tension between that kind of target-based approach and needing to affect that behavioural change at ground level, and not just at ground level, I mean, in all sectors of economy and society, because like the level of transformation that is required between now 2030, now 2050, is absolutely mind-blowing. You know, we have so much to do. There's so much change that needs to be put in place, and so many really, really positive outcomes that can be delivered, which need to be reinforced constantly with the public and with every sector of society.
Well said. Building on the theme, Maurice, of those healthy tensions, you were starting to build on one there towards the end of your presentation, where you were asking about, you know, where is money best spent, and is it on, you know, citizens doing their electric cars and their retrofits and all of that, where we're trying to be proactive, and should we be, you know, looking decades hence and going, start protecting our coastlines now by building defence walls? Is there a healthy tension? Have we grappled with that yet? Are we doing the futuristic piece and doing the real time?
Well, there's certainly a tension there. Whether it's a healthy tension, I don't know. And maybe it's a challenge more than a tension. Like for any public administration in Ireland or anywhere else, how can you really, in all conscience, put aside billions of euro for something that's going to happen in 50 years, no matter how extreme it is, when you have a housing crisis, a health crisis, everything else right now? You know, I'm challenged with that, even though I'm dealing with the figures every day and probably see it more than most other people, but we have to. And I mean, what Mark has said there about the climate crisis per se, I mean, doesn't it really arise because, like, we knew this was happening 50 years ago, and really we just didn't want to hear about it. We pushed it away, we tried to deny it, and we're now grappling with the challenge when I hope it's not too late. So we're going to have to try somehow and do everything, because it is really all about behaviour. Unless we as a society are behaving differently, you know, we're not going to be able to get the moral authority to make those long-term investments while still recognising that there's a whole load of short-term things we need to do. It's like the kids, you know, like your 6-year-old coming home from school with the plastic bottles and all excited about saving the world by collecting bottles, and they're absolutely right. And they really make you feel very guilty about this. But it's only through that sort of process that we'll get it right. So everything ties in together. I mean, you could say there's no point in saving energy in a building like this. It's very old. It's going to cost an absolute fortune to make a tiny, tiny change. It's not going to save the world. We're better off investing in the River Lee outside the door. But that's wrong too, because unless we have a rounded approach, we're not going to get it right. We'll make one or two decisions, but we won't make the totality. The answer is above my pay grade, but this is the challenge, I think, for everybody in this room.
Collectively, yeah. Rachel, I'm going to come to a question on Slido for you, but just if there's questions from the audience, do just get your hand up and we'll get a mic to you now in a minute. But the question on Slido, Rachel, that I thought I'd pose to you is this, and we might build on your theme about collaboration and creativity. And this person says, Minister Darragh O'Brien said on climate change is every state agency's job now. What unlikely actions could public service state agencies take? I guess this is to the idea of the collaborations, the creativity. And I wonder, just have you seen different approaches, maybe in Northern Ireland, that get to this point of not the likely actions, but are there unlikely things that maybe put us all outside our comfort zones and into different scenarios maybe we haven't thought about before?
Yeah, it's a good question, not an easy one. Yeah, I do think it starts with that creative approach. I think it starts from looking at what's stopping people at the moment, taking action, whether within organisations or within the general population. And I think that very often, as I said, that's, well, I'll give you an example within the context of the psychological theory of behaviour change that I would use, which is COM-B. And it's got 6 drivers of behaviour, essentially, and that talks about 2 types of capability, physical and psychological, that are needed for any behaviour. Opportunity, we've got that physical, and we've got that social opportunity, and that's our surroundings, are the physical. The social is those social norms we hear about, what people like us that we can relate to are doing. And then we've got a motivation area, and that's both automatic, the kind of feelings that we have about our behaviours, and then the thought and the planned and those other habitual aspects to what we do. I think if we in government and within our organisations, where we're trying to bring about change and to contribute, and as Maurice said, each doing our bit, if we could start by saying, really getting down to the nitty-gritty, for me to have success in this particular policy or in this particular piece of work we're trying to drive, really break it down into what do we need the people to do and what are those ingredients in each of those cases. And it's a systematic approach, as I said, and it's not quick initially, but it means that whatever we do is better targeted. And there's nothing earth-shattering about what I'm talking about here, but it still is. It's something still quite innovative. We're not really doing it. So I think if there could be that one change where we look at it, as I said, from that user perspective and better empathise, better see what's standing in the way of these things happening at the moment, I think that would better drive the directions that we're all taking with a view to that one big outcome.
Great, thank you, and thank you for the question on Slido. Anyone in the room have a question? Put your hand up and we'll get a mic to you. It's a little bit hard to see from here, so give me a wave. There must be somebody with a question. Don't be shy. Nobody? We'll come and find you. Give me a wave when I'm looking out again in a minute. Mark, in terms of everything that we've talked about, the need for collaboration, the challenges, the tensions, what do you think is the role, though, of the public service? Because, well, maybe there's multiple roles, you know, the regulator, the funder, the enabler, the demonstrator of good practice. Like, you know, for everyone in the room here, I suppose that's the problem here, is there's a lot of noise. It's hard to see what exactly is the role, how do you answer the calling, how do you get those quick wins that we've all talked about, and yet it shouldn't be a binary choice with the futuristic investments.
Yeah, just to pick up on the question that was posed to Rachel there, I mean, I think, like, I'm a civil servant of long standing. I won't tell you how long, but it's well into the multiple decades at this stage. And I think one of the challenges as in an individual public servant, you know, we go about our jobs. We have a good understanding of what the job specification is or what we're meant to do. You generally, as a public servant, understand what public procurement is, what public financial procedures are, staff management and all the rest, until you get to a point, and I said this at the Civil Service Management Board last September, until you get to a point where every single public servant understands that part of my job spec is to do stuff in climate action, so that you're looking at any piece of work that comes through across your desk, you're looking at it through the lens of climate action. Where does this add or subtract from what the overall objective may be? And I think that cultural piece is really, really important. Like the role of the public service is so multifaceted. Like when you think of the transformational changes that the public service have made on the environment front over the last few years, small things that have had huge impacts. Plastic bag levy, smoky coal ban, which you're now extending, is not specifically linked to climate action, but the introduction of the smoking ban in pubs and workplaces, LATA levies, which will be introducing deposit and return schemes. These small regulatory things that you introduce will have profound impacts. We're regulating now for, or we have legislated now for a carbon tax where the funding will be directly go back into retrofit, directly go back into supporting households who are vulnerable to energy poverty, and directly go back into supports to farming communities to allow them to undertake environmental issues. So I think right across the spectrum of issues that the public sector is responsible for, clever investment in R&D, governance and accountability, investing the money appropriately under the National Development Plan, where a lot of it is targeted climate action. That proof of concept piece that I mentioned, where on PUS, a world beater in terms of what it has done, the citizen engagement. There's such a multiplicity of things, but I think for me, a large part of it comes down to embedding that culture at all levels within the public service, where people are saying, climate action is part of what I do in my role. I think that's a really important piece.
Yeah, and the lens through which we all look. That's great. Any question from the audience? Oh, we do. Great, thank you.
So I thought it was very interesting, Mark's point around the percentage of people that were both worried, aware and wanting to take action in relation to climate. And then when I heard Rachel's point around the intention gap, I suppose as civil servants, how do we address the barriers or understand the barriers in terms of the intention, where the data that we have available to us and the way we normally collect data in terms of asking people certain questions and they say, yes, I am aware and I do want to take action. How do we then understand what those real barriers are between that and actually taking action, and then identify those policy levers, to your point earlier, Mark, around carrier bag levies and different policy levers that we have to try and drive the change that we need? I suppose it's embedding that across the civil service is quite difficult.
So in terms of the worry bit, I can assure you I'm in a constant state of worry about a whole lot of different things. I suppose the approach that we've sought to take in developing the climate action plan is we've engaged very, very extensively with all sectors of the public sector, so colleagues in transport, agriculture, people best placed to know their own sectors, industry, built environment, and we've developed a suite of actions which we believe will deliver on the level of emissions reduction at least cost over the next period of time. We went out with a call to evidence to the academic institutions. We also went out with a call for evidence to the general public. Excuse me. So we have a fairly decent handle, we think, on what are the steps that need to be taken to move from, I was going to say inertia, but it's a bad term, but it's as good a term as I think I can come up with at the moment, to very significant action. But you're monitoring and evaluating and stress testing that all the time, because what the legislation requires you to do is update your climate action plan every year. You back the horses that you think will deliver over the next 5 to 10 years. What the climate action plan and the programme for government has also said is, we don't know yet the technologies that will deliver for the 25 to 30 period or the 30 to 35 period. So I think it's to use the best scientific evidence that are available to us, to consult with the people who are at the front line in areas like agriculture, the farming community, the representative organisations there, bring it back and tailor a set of actions that will deliver the outcomes that are required. But the other piece then is to circle back with people who have been surveyed, who are expressing the concerns that they have and are looking to the government and others to provide that clarity of action and to keep consulting. So the National Dialogue on Climate Action that we initiated last year, it's been followed up by a series of climate conversations this year, which the Minister has chaired. He's had 2, I believe, and a 3rd due in November. So we're getting that constant feedback loop from people, where we're able to ask the question, are we doing the right thing? Are we resolving the concerns that you have? Where's the gap? And is there more that the system needs to do?
Great, thank you for the question. Very quickly, Rachel.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? Another aspect is that I think triangulating our quantitative data with qualitative research findings is essential, because whilst we've got great data when it comes to the numbers in terms of those intentions of what people would do according to what they purport, understand why they don't do it to me, takes a much more qualitative approach, an approach that allows for the understanding of the why, understanding those deeper drivers and those deeper motivational factors. And that's the difference between bringing those numbers and supporting and supplementing and those in-depth interviews, for example, that tell us the why and get into that aspect of things. And together, I think that sort of triangulated science and that kind of those sorts of methods, I think, are more robust.
Great, thank you. Maurice, I'm going to give the final word in under 30 seconds. Is there any final call to action that you want to leave people with coming out of what has been incredibly insightful? And thank you to each of you.
Just maybe to reinforce the point that Mark made, as public servants, what we can individually do is just live, breathe, think, act, climate action, climate awareness in everything we do, and be optimistic. The tiny, tiny difference that whatever you're doing as you move your pen across the paper or your fingers across the keyboard might seem insignificant, but it's not. And if everybody did that, we'd all make great progress. That's what we must do, and we will get on top of this if we all do it.
It's a great way to sum up. Thank you for that. Maurice Buckley, Rachael Singleton and Mark Griffin. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you, folks. That was brilliant.